I knew something was wrong even before I opened the door. The sidewalk in front of my house was too clean. The mat that always lay under the porch was gone, as if someone had swept away any trace that I lived there. My hands were still trembling from the hospital. The nurse had told me it was nothing serious, just common weakness after a cardiac catheterization. But what awaited me there was much worse than any diagnosis. The doorknob was unlocked. I entered slowly, expecting to see my armchair next to the bookshelf, Michael's childhood photos, the smell of my corn cake that always permeated the wood. But the emptiness was deafening. The house was completely emptied, and on the kitchen counter, a folded note in my son's handwriting. "Mom, we had to make some changes while you were gone. Before we continue, let me know in the comments what you're thinking. And of course, don't forget to subscribe, my dear. You need a place better suited for your condition. Please understand. Michael." I reread that 3 times, as if my brain refused to accept those words. My heart, already weakened, beat in irregular waves. I walked to the bedroom. Nothing. Not my blue crochet blanket, nor the box of letters I kept from my late husband. Not even the hospital bracelet I had accidentally left there before my admission. Every detail erased as if I had never existed there. My breathing began to falter. I leaned against the wall, eyes fixed on the note, trying not to fall. Outside, the Asheville sky was clear, the same cold blue that had so often calmed me. But now everything seemed aggressively silent. I sat on the porch steps with shaky legs. The next-door neighbor, an old man who rarely said good morning, stood on the sidewalk. His eyes avoided mine. He knew. Everyone there knew. Brooke, my daughter-in-law, always had that overly polite way about her. She smiled at the neighbors, brought cupcakes to street meetings, but inside, I always knew. She wanted me gone. I just didn't imagine she'd have the audacity to erase me like this, while I was still alive. The next afternoon, after wandering around the city with only a purse and the thin coat I wore to the hospital, I found a modest room in an old hotel near downtown. I sat there for hours, staring at the beige wall, trying to understand at what exact moment my usefulness had expired. I raised Michael alone after his father died. I worked as a seamstress to pay for his college. I sold my engagement ring to help him open his first company. When he and Brooke moved into my house temporarily with the baby, I gave up all my habits to welcome them. I gave them the master bedroom, cooked for them, took care of my grandson while Brooke did yoga and pretended to be an online entrepreneur. And now I was a burden. It was on the 3rd day at the hotel that I decided to go back to the house. Not to beg. I just wanted to understand what they were doing with everything. The doorbell no longer worked. I knocked hard on the door, and it was Brooke who answered. She was wearing a beige hoodie, hair tied back, phone in hand. Her gaze passed over me as if I were an intruder. "Lorraine, you should be resting," she said, without even fully opening the door. "This is all for your own good. Michael and I thought it best to start organizing things before your return. We're looking at assisted living options. You'll like it. It's all very modern." I stood there, in shock. "Are you selling my house?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She just sighed. "You need to rest, Lorraine. We'll take care of everything for you." I left there with trembling legs, but I didn't cry. Not yet. I took a taxi to the old building where, years ago, I used to teach community embroidery classes. The caretaker was still the same. His name was Clifford, and he recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Aldridge? I haven't seen you since the 2015 Winter Festival." When I explained what had happened, he scratched his beard and led me to a small studio in the back of the building, a space that was once used by volunteers and had been empty for months. "It's simple, but it's yours if you want it." When I entered, I saw an old sofa bed, a window overlooking the alley, and a rusty kettle on the sink. It was more than I had at that moment. That night, I sat on the sofa and opened my purse. The note was still there. My son's handwriting, which I had so often helped him perfect on his homework, was now proof of my exclusion. I picked up my old recipe book and turned to the last pages. There were some old documents, a copy of the house deed, mortgage payment receipts, tax notes. My eyes widened. The house was still in my name. They never legally transferred it. My son never asked for my signature, And at that moment, a phrase from my late husband echoed in my head. Don't sign away what you built, not even for your son. That was enough to rekindle something within me. The next morning, even before the sun touched the rooftops of Asheville, I put a blanket around my shoulders and walked to the small coffee shop that still remembered my orders. It was a cozy place, where the smell of strong coffee and freshly baked sweet bread seemed to envelop you like a hug. I chose a table in the corner, ordered chamomile tea, and took the papers out of my bag. With an eyebrow pencil, I began to underline dates, names, and codes I hadn't read in years. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew that deed well. My name was there as the sole owner. The house was mine. The silence of the coffee shop was interrupted by a Lorraine. I looked up and saw a familiar figure, Rachel Monroe, a church friend I hadn't seen since before the pandemic. Her eyes, upon seeing my papers and my face, filled with concern. I sat with her for almost an hour and told her everything. She listened in silence, only interrupting to hold my hand or shake her head in disbelief. When I finished, Rachel took a deep breath and said, "You can't let this happen. I know someone, a lawyer. He helped my sister when her husband tried to take her inheritance. He's fair, Lorraine, and very good at what he does." I took down the contact right there, on the back of a napkin. The name was simple and strong, Clifford Adams, the same name as the caretaker of the building where I now lived. "Too much of a coincidence," I said with a half-smile. Maybe it was a sign. That same afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with the lawyer. Clifford Adams was a tall, gray-haired man with a serene voice and a gaze that conveyed more patience than haste. We sat in a stuffy little room in an office upstairs from a pharmacy. I handed him all the papers, and he read them carefully, taking notes by hand as he listened to my story. When I finished, he simply said, "They have no right to sell your house, and if they have already started any process, we will legally stop them." That sentence, spoken with such firmness, made me breathe deeply for the first time in days. I wasn't as alone as I thought. "But you need to be prepared, Lorraine," he added, with a firm look. "When they realize you won't give in, they will turn against you. They will try to convince you, manipulate you, maybe even emotionally threaten you. Are you ready for that?" I closed my eyes for an instant. I saw my grandson's face, the mornings we spent in the garden, the stories told at night. Then, I remembered the note, the locked door, Brooke's empty words. When I opened my eyes, my answer came clear. Yes, they taught me how to say no. Clifford smiled respectfully. "Then let's start right now." We spent hours organizing the documents, preparing an injunction to prevent any ongoing transaction, and drafting a formal notice of possession. At the end, he looked at me and said, "We will file this discreetly. As soon as the real estate agents try to move forward with the sale, they will hit a legal wall." That gave me strength. I walked back to the studio slowly, feeling each step like a new pillar being built under my feet. I was no longer just a wounded woman. I was rebuilding myself in silence, and that was more powerful than any scream. In the following days, I allowed myself small rescues of the woman I used to be. I took my old sewing machine out of its dusty box. I spent hours remodeling an old blouse, as if each stitch was a thread of dignity being realigned. The radio tuned to instrumental music, the kettle whistling on the stove, and the rhythmic sound of the needle created a kind of silent prayer. I realized that it had been years since I had created something just for myself. My life had been entirely given to others, and now, in that meaningful solitude, I felt a peace I had never experienced in the noisy mansion full of demanding voices. That's when the phone rang. The number was Michael's. My heart tightened, but I answered. On the other end, he tried to sound natural, as if nothing had happened. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to see how you are. Brooke is worried." I smiled ironically. "Worried, are you?" "Yes. Maybe we acted too hastily. We just wanted to protect you." He hesitated, and then asked in a carefully low voice, "Can we meet, just to talk a little?" I knew what was behind that request. They had received the lawyer's notice, and they were panicking. We arranged a discreet coffee meeting downtown, near the municipal market. I arrived early, chose the most visible table in the room, and ordered tea. They arrived together, of course. Brooke with her oversized sunglasses and a coat too expensive for an ordinary afternoon. Michael looked tired, tense. They sat down as if they were going to a funeral. She opened the conversation with a forced smile. "Lorraine, we're so sorry for the misunderstanding. We didn't mean to hurt you." I didn't answer. I just watched. Michael continued. "We received a notice. Are you sure you want to go through with this? We can resolve everything as a family." The word family stung like vinegar on an open wound. I took a deep breath. I looked at them both calmly and said, "I've already resolved it, Michael. I only came here so you could look me in the eyes and understand. I am no longer at your disposal." The shock was visible. Brooke bit her lips, and he leaned back in his chair as if the air had left his lungs. She tried one last argument. "We just wanted to secure our family's future. We thought you'd understand." I picked up my purse, left a sealed envelope on the table with a copy of the deed and the signed notice. "Now you know what it means to underestimate a woman who sacrificed everything." And I left, leaving behind the most deafening silence I had ever witnessed. That night, back in my small studio, I let the deed envelope rest on the table like a silent trophy. It wasn't about the house itself. It was about everything it represented. The time, the love, the sleepless nights, the carefully prepared birthdays, the knees on the floor cleaning up what others had messed up. They tried to erase my history like sweeping dry leaves. But now every leaf was in its rightful place, catalogued, signed, recognized by law. I prepared my lavender tea and sat by the window, watching the city lights, listening to the world move on. And for the first time in many years, I didn't feel left behind. I felt free. In the following days, Clifford Adams maintained constant contact. A real estate agent, known for his discretion and ethics, had already started the process of selling the house, confidentially. "They won't know anything until the transfer is finalized," he assured me. And so, while Michael and Brooke still believed they had control of the situation, I was already 3 steps ahead. Behind the scenes, stitching not just fabrics, but my future. I began to visit small fabric stores, rediscovering my taste for textures, patterns, and fine needles. Some shopkeepers even recognized me, with a gentle gleam in their eyes. "Mrs. Aldridge, are you sewing again?" I smiled. "Yes, I am, for myself this time." One afternoon, among rolls of linen and raw cotton, I found a group of women in a beginner's sewing class. The coordinator was young, sweet, but clearly overwhelmed. She asked for my help to correct some students' stitches, and at the end of the class asked if I could give a workshop the following week. I said yes, with a warm heart. For the first time in years, someone wanted something from me that wasn't a sacrifice. It was recognition. I walked home that night with threads in my pockets and lightness on my shoulders, and I decided I would sew again, but now only my own story. Meanwhile, my son's messages began to change tone. After the calm came desperation. "Mom, we don't have to go this far. This will destroy us. For God's sake, think of your grandson." I read them all with serenity. My grandson, that sweet boy now grown up, never called me the entire time I was in the hospital. He never came to visit me. I loved him, but there was no longer any room in me to confuse affection with complicit silence. I deleted the messages and blocked the number, not out of revenge, for sanity, for self-care, for justice. The final trigger came in the form of an unexpected call from the real estate agent. "Lorraine, we have 3 offers in hand, above the estimated value. The property has historical potential. The buyers loved the details of the original construction. Can we move forward with the best offer?" I took a deep breath. That house where I was invisible to those I loved most was now desired by complete strangers. "Go ahead, yes," I replied, "but ask the lawyer to deliver the final documents in person." I wanted the fall to be real, concrete, and visible, and so it was. Exactly 7 days later, on a rainy Friday morning, Clifford called me. "They received the notice today. The house has been sold. The new deed is already registered. And the new owners will move in 30 days. I sent the bailiff with the formal notification." I felt the blood rush strongly through my veins, as if all the times I had been left in silence now screamed together inside me. "Thank you, Clifford. They have no idea what they taught me when they locked me out." He laughed. "And now, Lorraine, what will you do with all that money?" I already knew the answer. That same afternoon, I went to the bank. I opened a new account, only in my name and requested the initiation of a support fund for women over 60 in situations of family abandonment. I named it Patches of Dignity. I explained to the manager in a firm voice that this fund would be used to finance shelters, vocational courses, and microcredits for women who, like me, were discarded when they ceased to be convenient. She tried to hold back her emotion as she typed my details. "I've never seen anyone do this, Mrs. Aldridge." I smiled serenely. "It's because most of us learn to suffer in silence. But I've learned to speak." The following week, I received a handwritten letter with no sender, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Brooke. She asked for forgiveness. She said it was all a misunderstanding, that they were having financial difficulties, that Michael was depressed, that the boy was asking about me. All very well rehearsed. But the last sentence was what interested me. "If there's any way to reverse it, we can talk." Reverse. As if I had made a mistake by defending myself. That made me nauseous. I burned the letter in the studio ashtray and swept the ashes with the palm of my hand. A silent liberation, like everything I've been doing. On Saturday, I walked to the city market. The autumn air smelled of apple, cinnamon, and possibilities. I passed the flower stall, bought a small pot of lavender, and took it to the studio. I placed it on the windowsill, next to the kettle. That space, once sober and temporary, was now my definitive refuge. I prepared a new cup of tea, sat down at the sewing machine, and looked at the world with eyes that, finally, saw clearly. They never imagined that by distancing me from the house, they were giving me back to myself. The following week, while local newspapers highlighted the high appreciation of historic properties in Asheville, my name was discreetly mentioned in a neighborhood column. Aldridge property sold above market. New owners will take over in 30 days. Nothing more. No mention of the family drama behind it. And that's exactly how I wanted it. But the neighbors started talking. Mrs. Whitaker, from the blue house next door, crossed paths with me at the bakery and said, with a hesitant smile, "I heard about the sale. So you're really starting over?" I replied with a simple, "Yes, now on my own terms." And she just nodded respectfully. People were starting to understand. But who didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, was Michael. The calls resumed. Now, with a different tone. First, a choked voice. Then, accusations. "You're destroying our family out of pride. What will you tell your grandson when he finds out you put them out on the street?" I didn't answer, because he still hadn't understood the most painful truth. I didn't destroy anything. They broke every bond, stitch by stitch, when they treated me like disposable furniture. The echo of that note lived on in my memory. Please understand. I understood. I understood everything. When the bailiff finally affixed the notice to the door of my old house, Clifford told me that Brooke had collapsed. She tried to argue, to say there was a verbal agreement, that I had given the house to them as proof of love. But love is not proven with real estate. It is proven with presence, with respect, with listening. None of that was offered to me. And now, every excuse they tried to build crumbled before signed documents, official seals, and impartial witnesses. The charade ended there, and the world, even if not entirely, began to see who was who. I received an unexpected visit on a cold November morning. It was Clara, a young social worker who worked with shelters for elderly women. She came to my studio with a simple bouquet of wildflowers and a brown envelope in her hands. "I read about the fund you created. I'm here on behalf of many. Your gesture is already making a difference." Those words hit me harder than any apology. I sat with her, drank tea, and listened to stories that sounded like mine. Women driven out of their homes by children, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, women called burdens, invisible. And there, over shared tea, I understood that my story was not an anomaly. It was a mirror. That night, I sat before the sewing machine and embroidered something new. A simple quilt made from old scraps of my dresses, fabrics inherited from my mother, leftover trousseau I never used. In the center, I wrote in burgundy thread, "They only miss you when you say no." That was no longer resentment. It was memory. It was a manifesto. It was a mark. That piece became part of the first exhibition of the Patches of Dignity project, set up in partnership with Clara and other women who now felt seen. My studio became a workshop. My hands, once underestimated, now guided others. A few weeks later, walking through the local fair, I found a group of neighbors gathered around a flyer. It was a summons for the official eviction from the house. Many whispered, "I saw Mrs. Whitaker again." She approached, this time with a different tone. "Brooke said you were cruel, but everyone here knows how much you did for that family." I replied gently, "I wasn't cruel. I was firm. And firmness, to those who never had limits, sounds like cruelty." She smiled, discreetly, and I continued on my way, as someone who finally walks without needing to explain herself. The eve of the eviction was rainy. I stayed home, sewing in silence, listening to the water run down the city gutters. I knew that the next day, Michael and Brooke would be forced to leave, that their world, sustained by convenience and false kindness, would collapse. But I felt no pleasure in it. I felt justice. The justice of someone who spent her whole life saying yes until she was discarded for no longer being useful. And now, by saying no, she had recovered the right to be treated as a person, not as property. On the day of their departure, I didn't go there. I didn't want to watch. I didn't want to make my liberation a spectacle. Instead, I went to the main cafe, ordered my favorite tea, and sat at the central table, the same one where it all began. The waitresses already knew me. One of them said, "Today's the day, isn't it?" I just smiled. I didn't need to confirm anything. The world was already speaking for me. As I drank, I watched an older couple in the corner, exchanging shy laughs. An old woman by the window was calmly embroidering, and I, there, in the middle of life, felt that I belonged again. That afternoon, I received a final message from Clifford. All done, keys delivered, account activated, amount received. They left in silence, with their heads down. I took a deep breath. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I just closed my eyes and thanked myself for not signing away my own invisibility. In silence, I had written my name again on the line of dignity, and now it was impossible to erase it. In the following days, tranquility settled in like a quilt slowly unfolding. It wasn't a tense silence like before. It was a clean, fertile emptiness. The house was no longer mine, and that, curiously, liberated me. With the sale money deposited, I completed all the procedures for the Patches of Dignity Fund and scheduled the first meeting with the women supported by the program. They would arrive from different neighborhoods with distinct stories, but all with the same wound, having been discarded by those who promised to love them. I prepared teas, fruits, and put cushions on the floor. My studio, once a solitary retreat, was becoming a collective shelter. That morning, when the first ones arrived, I observed their gazes, timid, distrustful, but full of hope. An elderly woman named Gloria, 78, said she had been left at the hospital and never picked up by her children. Another, Lucinda, had signed papers without understanding that she was giving away the house where she had lived for 40 years. They looked at me as if I were strong, but I knew that my strength didn't come from a special gift. It was born from exhaustion, from the limit, from that note on the table that said, "Please understand." It was there that I stopped accepting and began to exist. We talked for hours. We laughed, we cried, we hugged. One of them, too young to be there, perhaps in her early 50s, held my hand and said, "You named the pain we couldn't explain. You taught us that saying no is not ingratitude. It's survival." That echoed in me for the rest of the day. When the group left, they left behind used cups and a new feeling, belonging. I had lost a house, but gained something much greater, a network, a mission, a second chance to use my voice, no longer to keep the peace, but to restore justice. Before you continue, if this story has touched your heart in any way, please tell me where you're reading from. It's moving to know how far these words reach and how many other women might feel seen through this story. Your comment can be part of this silent chain of recovered dignity. Later that same day, I was surprised by an envelope left discreetly at my door. No name, no sender. Inside, only a photo of my grandson holding a little card drawn with colored pencils. "I miss you, Grandma." For a second, I felt my eyes well up. It wasn't anger. It was longing for the boy who once ran between my legs asking for cookies and stories. But I knew I couldn't delude myself. That image had been sent by someone who learned to manipulate feelings. who used even the boy as a bridge for return. I held the photo fondly, but I didn't reply. The next morning, I went to the Asheville Legal Aid Center to formalize a decision. I would link all the rest of my assets to the fund. Nothing more would be automatically inherited by blood ties. Love that depends on a will is not love. It's an investment. Clifford helped me review everything patiently. When we finished, he looked at me with deep respect and said, "You are rewriting what it means to grow old in this country." I smiled. Maybe I'm just sewing more carefully this time. I started taking long walks around the area. I observed the old facades, the hurried people, the fake smiles, and the sincere hugs. The world was an imperfect embroidery, but still full of beauty. One day I saw Brooke at the pharmacy. She looked worn, wearing ordinary clothes, her hair loose and deep circles under her eyes. Our eyes met. She hesitated, as if to say something, but just looked away and hurried out. That confirmed what I already knew. There was nothing left to say. Silence was now my shield. And she, for the first time, knew what it meant not to be heard. I returned home, hung a new linen curtain I had sewn myself, and sat down with a photo album. I opened to the old pages, to the impromptu backyard parties, the trips I never took because it was better to save money, the sleepless nights rocking fevers that weren't mine. And there, amidst the memories, I realized that I had not lived in vain. Everything I gave blossomed, even if those who received it had forgotten. My story did not end in abandonment. It began again in consciousness. And now, each new chapter was written with firm ink and free hands. That same night, I dreamt of my husband. We were on the porch, drinking tea, as we did on Sundays. He smiled, peaceful. He looked at me as if saying, "I knew you'd find your way back." When I woke up, my eyes were damp, not from sadness, but from reunion. Reunion with myself, with my strength, with everything they taught me to hide so as not to bother. I got up, put on my shoes, tied a scarf around my neck, and walked to the market with firm steps. No one would take me out of my house again, even if the house was now just a studio that smelled of lavender. And for the first time, I no longer wished to return to the past. The present, finally, was enough. A few days later, while watering my new potted garden on the balcony, I heard dry knocks at the door. They weren't urgent, but they weren't gentle either. When I opened it, I saw them both standing there, Michael and Brooke. They looked different, their clothes simpler, their expressions heavier. For a moment, I thought they were going to beg, but no. Michael held a brown folder, and Brooke, a carefully calculated expression. "We came to talk," he said. "Can we come in?" I replied, with the same serenity with which they had snatched me from my own home. "No, but you can speak from here." Brooke was the first to try. "We know you sold the house. We know we have no right to anything anymore. But we wondered if there might be some way for us to start over. A new coexistence for your grandson." I interrupted her before the act continued. "You no longer have access to my life for convenience. And the grandson you speak of, the one who never visited me in the hospital, no longer recognizes my voice. You taught him to forget me. Now teach him to live with the consequences." Michael lowered his head. Brooke, on the other hand, continued, "It's not fair what you're doing. You're throwing away the family." I took a deep breath and replied, "No. I'm recovering from the shards of the family you threw at me. They insisted. They tried to use memories, old moments, even forced smiles. They said they were having financial difficulties, that they had nowhere to go, that the money from the sale would solve everything. I listened, not out of pity, but because I learned that listening doesn't mean accepting. When they finished, I walked to the small table next to the door, picked up an envelope, and handed it to my son. "Here are the contacts for social programs, support centers, and the address of the nearest shelter." Brooke's eyes widened. Michael looked embarrassed. "But Mom—" "Lorraine," I corrected. "Now you call me by my name. The title of mother was revoked when I was treated as an intruder." I closed the door calmly. I didn't slam it. I didn't shout. I just closed it. And I sat at the table with my cup of tea, watching them retreat down the sidewalk through the window, muttering to each other, visibly shaken. For the first time, they had received a no with no escape, no loopholes, and that dismantled them more than any speech. I realized then that true power is not in winning an argument. It's in no longer needing to have one. They no longer had a way to hurt me, and that, in itself, was my victory. In the days that followed, I returned to my routine. The workshops, shared tea with the women in the group, walks around the city. Each day, a new story reached me. An elderly woman put out for caring for her sick granddaughter. A grandmother whose pension was forcibly taken by her children. A painful pattern repeated on every corner. And with it, grew the certainty that my previous silence fed the system I was now fighting. I used part of the fund to rent an old house downtown and transform it into the first patchwork house, a welcoming space with workshops, meals, and listening. The inauguration took place on a cold Saturday afternoon. We invited women from the city, community leaders, social workers. I gave a brief, simple speech. This place is not a shelter. It's a reminder that we are still whole, even when they want to discard us. Muted applause filled the room, followed by sincere tears and shy hugs. And there, with my hands intertwined with those of other women who had also survived abandonment, I realized I had transformed my pain into a bridge and my loneliness into a home. That same week, I received a message from a local journalist. She had heard about the fund, the sold house, the embroidery exhibition with phrases like, "They only miss you when you say no." She wanted to tell my story. For a moment, I hesitated. I never liked cameras. I always preferred the backstage, the silence, the invisible stitching of things. But something made me accept. Perhaps because by speaking, I could help other women realize that they could still rise, that it wasn't too late, that it wasn't weakness to choose oneself. The interview was brief, done inside the studio. No production, makeup, or poses. Just me, my sewing machine in the background, the kettle on the stove, and an unadorned truth. I told how I was removed from my own home without an apology. How I discovered, in an envelope, that my story was worth nothing to them anymore. And how, by losing everything, I found what had been stolen from me decades ago. My identity. The journalist looked at me with tearful eyes. "Do you think you can forgive them someday?" she asked at the end. I smiled gently. Forgiveness is freedom. But today, my priority is to forgive myself for waiting so long to say no. The story aired on a Tuesday afternoon on a local Asheville channel. It was a small program with a modest audience, but the impact was immediate. The next day, I received over 50 messages, some from women thanking me, others from neighbors apologizing for never getting involved, and even young people who wrote saying, "You made me look at my grandmother differently." My phone, once used only to confirm medical appointments, now became a bridge between hidden stories and possibilities for reconstruction. It was as if, by narrating my pain, I had authorized others to do the same. But with the exposure, unexpected reactions also came. Michael sent me a long message. It wasn't angry, nor blackmail. It was a real letter. He said he watched the interview with his grandson on his lap, that he cried. That, for the first time, he understood the extent of the damage. He said Brooke had left home for a few days. He said the boy asked about me, and that he didn't know how to answer. "You were always there, Mom, and I didn't even realize when I stopped seeing you as a person." That affected me. Not because I wanted to go back, but because it was the first time he had looked at himself with honesty. I replied with few words. "It took me time to see my worth. Now I cannot become invisible again. Take care of yourself. Take care of your son. I will be fine." He didn't insist. He didn't try to manipulate. He just thanked me. And that, for me, was the closest thing to peace we could have. Not a reconciliation, but a ceasefire between past hurts and new boundaries. For the first time, we spoke as two adults aware of our mistakes, no longer as mother and son in a relationship of eternal debt. That conversation, brief and clean, was worth more than all the thank yous I had ever received. That week, I participated in a discussion circle at the city library. The room was full. Women with gray hair, colorful scarves, hands marked by time. I shared excerpts from my diary. I read aloud the note left at my old house. I told how I transformed an empty space into a home and a no into a trench. When I finished, there was silence. Then a round of applause, not of excitement, but of respect. One of the women with tearful eyes approached and said, "Thank you for speaking. Now I know I'm not crazy for wanting my life back." I walked home with lighter shoulders. All of that, the meetings, the workshops, the silent encounters of recognizing eyes, showed me that my mission was no longer just personal. I had inadvertently become a symbol, and because of that, I needed to remain firm. I opened my agenda and planned new meetings, drafted a simple manual of legal protection for women over 60, with guidelines on inheritances, properties, pensions. I asked the City Hall for permission to distribute it for free at health centers and senior clubs. When I submitted the project, an official said, "It's the first time I've seen something like this." And I just smiled. It's because only now have we been allowed to exist. One late afternoon, I sat in the studio with the golden light streaming through the curtains and opened the old family album. The photos were there. Michael as a baby, Brooke smiling falsely at Christmas dinners, my grandson in the garden. Instead of pain, I felt distance, like someone looking at an old house where they once lived but no longer belonged. I closed the album, hugged the fabric I was sewing, and was grateful to have escaped that prison disguised as love. Sometimes, what they call family is just the first fence that prevents us from being who we are. The following Sunday, I organized the first collective coffee at the Patchwork House. Women brought pies, embroideries, old songs. We talked about simple things, recipes, flowers, good memories. Someone mentioned seeing Brooke in the center with her grandson and that she looked down. Another said Michael now sold used cars. I just listened, without hatred, without revenge, just with the firmness of someone who no longer lives in the past. Maybe now they'll learn, I thought. That silence can be stronger than any word. When the afternoon ended, I closed the house door with a tranquil sigh. I hung a new embroidery in the entrance hall. It read, "You don't have to inherit pain to belong." I felt a lump in my throat. So many years I believed I had to suffer in silence to be loved. So many years I confused loyalty with submission. But now, every stitch reminded me that it was possible to start over, even when we think there's no more time. One morning, while drinking my jasmine tea on the studio balcony, I received a formal letter from the bank. The Patches of Dignity Fund had reached its first service goal, with over 100 women assisted in just 3 months. A silent milestone, without parties, without headlines. But I knew each of those women was a world rescued. I felt my eyes well up. I thought of those who arrived with their souls in ruins, with words caught in their throats, and who now embroidered phrases of affirmation with firmness in their hands. They owed me nothing, and yet, looking at me, I saw true gratitude, the kind I never saw in my own home. That same day, a young social worker named Tara contacted me. She said she would like to expand the project to other cities in North Carolina. She wanted to take the idea to Greenville, then perhaps to Raleigh. "You have no idea the transformation you've caused," she said. "It's as if someone finally spoke aloud what everyone pretended not to see." I laughed. Speaking wasn't my strong suit. I spent my life listening. She squeezed my hand gently. "Well now, even in silence, you are shouting what matters." That phrase stayed with me for days. That night, I went to bed later than usual. I reviewed fund documents, planned new workshops, and updated a small diary where I wrote phrases that came to mind since the day I was discarded. On one page, I wrote, "I am not a martyr. I am a woman, and I deserve respect without having to bleed for it." I closed the notebook calmly. I looked around. The studio was no longer temporary. It was home, smelling of fabric paint, lavender, and bread baking on Sundays. Life hadn't gone back to what it was. It had become what it always should have been. Mine. Walking down one of the community center corridors a few days later, I saw a handmade sign taped to the wall. It was a child's invitation to a Grandma's Day at the local school. One of the names on the list was Brooks. She would be a volunteer storyteller. For a second, I felt a pang in my chest. But it wasn't jealousy. It was longing for what I thought I had, and what, in truth, never existed. My grandson would grow up without me, but he would one day know the truth. Maybe not now, but one day someone would tell him that the grandmother he lost was, in fact, the woman who had the courage to stop pretending. I stopped at a bench in front of the library and closed my eyes. I let the sun hit my face and imagined what my life would have been like if I had said no earlier. How many unmade trips, how many never-bought dresses, how many silences swallowed with hot tea. But I refused to fall into lament. Time doesn't go back, but the meaning we give it can change everything. And I had changed. The woman who was once driven from her own home was now a reference of autonomy for others. I no longer needed anyone to call me mother or wife or grandmother. I was Lorraine, whole. The following week I was invited to speak at a local university. It was a small lecture for a social work course. I went without pretension. I only brought my notebook, my quilt with embroidered phrases, and my silence. I told my story as if I were among friends. The students listened with absolute respect. At the end, one of them, young, with tears in her eyes, approached and said, "You made me understand my own mother. I thought she was being bitter. Now I see that she was just trying to survive." And she hugged me. That hug was worth more than 1,000 apologies that never came. I arrived home that night with a weight off my shoulders. It was as if the world was, finally, giving back everything that was taken from me. Not in money, not in favors, but in recognition. And that was what I needed. I sat down at the sewing machine and started a new project, an embroidered blanket for myself. Not to donate, not to display, just to warm my own feet on cold nights. It was the first time I had created something that wasn't to serve others. A simple gesture, but deeply symbolic, a self-hug. As I sewed, I heard the sound of fine rain tapping on the window. The city slept, and I, awake, calmly embroidered my new time. Every stitch reminded me I stayed, I resisted, and I blossomed. Even when they said there was no more room for me, I created space within myself, and it was there, in that remade space, that I built my home. A home that no one can take, because it lives in the consciousness that I, Lorraine Aldridge, exist for myself. And now, only those who see me as whole belong to me. A month after the university interview, I was invited to open a state event on dignified aging and support policies for women over 60. I wore a simple navy blue dress, my hair loose, and my patchwork quilt folded under my arm. The room was full. Among those present were politicians, community leaders, and other women like me. I walked onto the stage without rehearsed speeches. I held the microphone firmly and began with a sentence that still burned within me. They left me with a note on the table and my bags packed, but they forgot they also left me with the house deed. The audience reacted with murmurs of indignation and then a silence filled with attention. I spoke for 20 minutes, without tears, without anger, only truths. I told how I was discarded for convenience, how I gave up my voice for decades in the name of a family that saw me as a free servant, and how I discovered, outside that locked door, that being left behind was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it was there that I found the version of myself who no longer apologized for existing. When I stepped off the stage, I was met with hugs from women who, like me, had been trained to be silent. One of the organizers approached me later with an admiring look. He said he would like to make the Patches of Dignity project a regional public policy, that there were funds to expand the shelters. I thanked him humbly, not out of ambition, but because I knew that the more doors were opened, the fewer women would have to sleep on the street of emotional abandonment. That's how you won, stitch by stitch, word by word, until pain turned into fabric of strength. I wasn't seeking fame. I just wanted no one else to go through that alone. Later that night, I received an unexpected message. It was from my grandson. He had gotten my number from a schoolmate, he said. His message was simple. "Hi, Grandma. I saw a video of you. Can I see you someday?" My heart stopped for a moment. It took me a while to breathe, and for a few minutes I just stared at the screen, not knowing what to feel. He wasn't to blame. He was young. He was shaped by the adults around him. But I was still bleeding inside. I didn't reply right away. I left the message there, waiting for time to give me the courage to decide with a clean heart and not with the residue of resentment. The next morning, walking through the neighborhood, I was stopped by an elderly woman named Eleanor, who participated in the workshops. She handed me a handmade brooch with small embroidered lines that read, "Lorraine, the one who stood tall." I hugged her tightly. That wasn't a trophy. It was recognition. It was the translation of everything I fought to rebuild. I returned home with the brooch pinned to my chest. I looked at myself in the mirror. Loose white hair, calm eyes, wrinkles that told a story. Finally, I saw the woman I had spent my life hiding under the title of useful. That weekend, I organized a gathering in the garden of the new patchwork house. The sun was gentle, the wind carried the smell of fresh bread, and women of all ages sat in a circle with quilts, embroideries, and tea. A young woman named Miriam said she had escaped an abusive relationship, and that seeing my story, she found the courage to leave with just a backpack and her daughter in her arms. I wanted to thank you, Lorraine, because seeing you say no taught me that I could too. I held her hand, and in that gesture, I felt time bend. It was as if every tear of mine had planted a garden for others to walk on. At the end of the meeting, I left a box of blank cards and colorful pens on the table. I asked each of them to write a phrase they would have liked to hear at 60, 50, 40, or even 20 years old. Then I collected the cards. There were phrases like, "You don't need to prove anything." "Being strong is also crying." "You are valuable even when no one notices." I read each one in silence that night, alone in the studio, with the tea cooling in the cup, and I realized there was something in common among them all: the desire to be seen, to be heard. That's what was denied to us for so long, and that's what we were now taking back. I then decided to write a letter, not to Michael, not to Brooke, but to myself. I started like this: "Dear Lorraine, you survived. More than that, you blossomed. They made you believe there was no more space, but you built a new universe, sewn with your own fingers. Don't apologize anymore for staying, for saying no, for prioritizing yourself. You are your home now." I signed calmly, folded the sheet, and put it inside the old album. It was the last piece of the puzzle, recognizing the woman in the mirror as enough. That night, I went to sleep with the window open. I heard the sound of the city in the distance, muffled horns, distant laughter, the rustling of trees, and I thought, they can try to erase your story, but if you sew firmly, it survives time. Life took everything I thought was mine, but it gave me back what was always mine: my voice. The following Sunday, I baked a small carrot cake with lemon frosting, a recipe I only made on birthdays, but there was no special date on the calendar. The celebration was different. It was the first symbolic birthday of the new Lorraine. 1 year since I stopped being the mother who gives in, the convenient mother-in-law, the available grandmother, to become just who I was. I lit a solitary candle, put the slice on the blue porcelain plate inherited from my grandmother, and ate in silence, smiling to myself. It was a private party, but with the presence of all the versions that had brought me there. Later, I walked to the park where I used to take my young grandson to chase ducks. The bench where we sat was still there, the wood a little more worn, the iron already dull. I sat and watched the families around, children screaming, distracted mothers, grandmothers with bags full of snacks. No one recognized me, and for the first time, that didn't hurt. Not being recognized by a world that ignored me for so long was, in a way, liberating. I no longer needed to prove my existence. I was whole there, even if no one applauded. A little girl approached me, offering a flower she had plucked from the grass. "It's for you," she said, her eyes shining. I took the flower as one receives a prize. "Thank you, dear." She ran back to her mother, unaware that that gesture had been the purest recognition I could receive. I stayed there a little longer, with the flower in my hand, thinking about everything that was gone and everything that remained. And I decided, my story would not end with pain. It would end with presence, with small gestures, with a flower in my hand and my feet firm on the ground. Upon returning home, I opened a new page in the notebook where I wrote my reflections. At the top, I wrote, "Things I now allow," and I began to list, allowing myself to be cared for, allowing myself to say no, allowing myself to fail, allowing myself to start over after 70. I wrote for hours, each line an old crack being filled with something new. In the end, I closed the notebook with a lightness I didn't know. It was as if, for decades, I had been a tenant in my own life. And now, finally, I had given myself the deed to what was always mine. That night, I replied to my grandson's message. Just one sentence. When you want to talk, I will be at peace here. No promises, no expectations. I knew he would need to find his own way, and perhaps he would never come. But what mattered was that I was no longer waiting outside any door. It was he now who was knocking, and I, with all the serenity in the world, would decide whether or not to open it. I spent the following days embroidering a new quilt. On it, I sewed phrases spoken by other women I met along the way. Phrases of strength, of pain, of rebirth. It was my homage to them, and to myself. At the end, I embroidered a line with tiny, almost invisible letters. They only miss you when you say no. But that's when you find yourself. That was it. The no, I said, was not an end. It was the beginning of a life that finally belonged to me. The exhibition of this new quilt took place at a local cultural center. Small, but full of meaning. People passed by, took photos, asked questions. I just observed. In the corner of the room, an elderly woman with sad eyes asked me if I didn't regret it. I replied with quiet firmness, I don't regret saying no. I regret saying yes for so long. She nodded, lowering her eyes, as if she too carried the same burden. And at that instant, another chain broke. Silently. On the way home, I bought fresh flowers, lavender and carnations, like the ones my husband used to plant in the backyard. I put them in a new vase, right in the center of the room. It was a small altar to my new life. I sat down, drank tea, read a passage from a forgotten book, and thought about how everything could have been different, but not with sadness, with pride. Because even with everything against me, I rebuilt, with my hands, with my voice, with my story. And so, the story they tried to silence ended, not with scandal, nor with revenge, but with dignity, with presence, with flowers in the window and tea in the cup, and with a certainty that would never abandon me again. I no longer need to be loved to exist. I exist because I chose to return to myself, and no one can take that from me.